55th anniversary of the 1965 Voting Rights Act and mourn the passing of civil rights leader John Lewis. The Kennedy Institute is proud to host this conversation that reflects on the landmark legislation and the current parallels to disenfranchisement that many of us are facing today. The Institute was humbled to host Congressman Lewis for a conversation in 2015. And as we reflect on his legacy, conscience, and commitment to nonviolence, I can think of no more important conversation to have that honors his memory. As Vicki Kennedy, the co-founder and president of the board at the Kennedy Institute, recently said, let us honor his life by continuing his work to make our country a more perfect union, where equality for all really means all. Just as did Congressman Lewis, Senator Kennedy believed in civil rights for every American, and voting rights are civil rights. Senator Kennedy was a staunch supporter for this legislation and had advocated for the elimination of the poll tax prior to its passage. Throughout his time in the United States Senate and the many revisions of the Voting Rights Act, Senator Kennedy worked with members of Congress, staff, and grassroots organizations to ensure that all voices were heard. He believed that voting is the cornerstone of our democracy, and that the more people who participate, the more efficient and effective our nation becomes. We're pleased to welcome three extraordinary individuals who worked with Senator Kennedy on the Voting Rights Act: Antonia Hernandez, Mark Schneider, and Burton Wides, and grassroots organizer Lydia Camarillo for this conversation today. I'd now like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, who's well known in the area of voting rights, Ari Berman. Ari is a senior reporter at Mother Jones, and his coverage on voting rights issues, the history of voting rights in America, modern radicalization of voter suppression, partisan gerrymandering, American politics, and the future of our democracy has appeared in numerous publications. He's a frequent guest and political commentator on MSNBC, NPR, PBS, and C-SPAN. Ari is also the author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. We are thrilled to have Ari as our esteemed panelists with us for this incredibly important conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ari to get us started. Ari?
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you so much to the Kennedy Institute for sponsoring this. It is a very timely conversation. I just want to start echoing Caroline, honoring John Lewis. I have been thinking a lot about John Lewis, and I've been thinking a lot about the Voting Rights Act, which is his greatest legacy since his passing last Friday. And I've been thinking about what a monumental piece of legislation the Voting Rights Act was, which these incredible four panelists are going to walk us through all of the amazing things it did, why it really is the country's most important civil rights law. I've also been thinking a lot about how John Lewis and the legacy of all of those people that fought for voting rights, like Senator Kennedy, like Bobby Kennedy, is being undermined today by a new attack on voting rights, that in the past decade, half the states in the country have passed new restrictions on voting. Things like strict voter ID laws and cutbacks to early voting and closing polling places. And in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act and unleashed a wave of new voter suppression in places like Texas and Georgia and Arizona, with a long history of voter discrimination. So on the one hand, we are going to celebrate all of the progress that was made under the Voting Rights Act, but we are also going to talk about the barriers that voters are still facing, and the fact that there is legislation right now before the Congress to restore the Voting Rights Act. And just yesterday, there was a bill introduced by Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont with 48 co-sponsors to restore the Voting Rights Act and to rename it after John Lewis. It is now called the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So all of this is great context for our discussion. Of course, we're going to be in an unprecedented election in 2020, where voting is going to be at the center of the conversation. Will states be able to handle vote by mail? Will you be able to vote safely in person? Will the results of the election be accepted by the sitting president? all of these are questions that we're grappling with that we didn't even think we would be talking about before this pandemic hit. So there's so much to discuss about both the past and the present when it comes to voting rights. So I am going to stop talking and I am going to turn it over to our esteemed panelists, starting with Lydia. Please begin, Lydia.
Thank you to the Edward Kennedy Institute for the invitation. It is an honor to be here with such a distinguished panel. Over the last 20 years, I have had the opportunity to be part of Southwest Voter Registration Education Project. In December of 2018, I was named president of one of the Latino legacy organizations. Southwest Voter is committed to empowering the Latino community through their vote. Since we opened our doors in 1974, Southwest Voter has registered 2.7 million Latinos, trained 150,000 Latino leaders, and won 210 voting rights lawsuits. I can honestly say that I started working on registering Latino voters when I was a freshman in college. I knew then that I wanted to work for MALDIF and Southwest Voter. I had the honor of working as a national leadership director under Antonia Hernandez's leadership. I am the daughter of immigrants, parents who were born and raised in Mexico. My husband and I are proud parents to two talented and intelligent young men. Today's discussion cannot be more relevant. The untimely passing of Congressman John Lewis, the racial inequalities exposed with the murder of George Floyd, and the global pandemic that is killing Latinos and African Americans disproportionately make this election the most important election of our lifetime, and the Voting Rights Act is needed to protect the vote. It helped our communities overcome legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote. It gave minority voters the chance to vote and determine their own destiny. The vote was and is a defense against racial discrimination and barriers. The Voting Rights Act banned the use of literacy tests, provided for federal oversight of voter registration in areas where Blacks and Latinos were not registered to vote, and authorized the U.S. Attorney General to investigate the use of poll tax in state and local elections. Black voters who attempted to vote were often told by election officials that they had gotten the wrong date, time, polling place, wrong, that they had possessed insufficient literacy skills, or that they had filled out an application incorrectly. The language voting communities often face the same social, economic disparities and logistical barriers that negatively impact other voters. They discriminated against by poll workers because their communication wasn't clear. In some cases, poll workers assume that language difficulties meant that the voter is ineligible to vote because the voter is not a US citizen, which is not the case. And the political process can be overly complicated for those who have immigrated from countries with no democratic systems. Immediately after the Shelby ruling, the city of Pasadena, Texas, swiftly moved to dismantle its single-member district elections to at-large voting systems. MALDIF immediately sued the city. The courts found these actions unconstitutional under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. In the Southwest Voter lawsuit against Texas voter ID law, the DC federal court found that the voter ID law was unconstitutional and determined Texas acted with intent to discriminate and dilute the Latino vote. Nonetheless, the Shelby ruling allowed Texas to retain its voter ID requirements. As a chair of the Texas Latino Redistricting Task Force, I led the effort in partnership with 7 other organizations, including MALDIF, MABA, WCBI. We filed a lawsuit, the legal challenge that ultimately increased the Latino majority districts at the Congressional and State House level. Ultimately, 9 Latino majority districts were drawn. 2+ gained new majority congressional districts. We also gained 4 state house Latino majority seats. MALDIF is our legal counsel. Think about this. Texas gained 4 new congressional districts because of the Black and Latino population growth. The Latino population grew by an estimated 65% from the last census count. Yet Texas took 1 Latino majority congressional district away when it retrogressed Congressional District 23. We won the legal challenge against Texas. It took almost 10 years. Our nation's history has demonstrated time and time again that our voting rights will be violated with intent to dilute the vote. The 2020 general election is the most consequential election of our time. We must get ready for long lines, less voting places, not enough ballots, efforts to intimidate voters, and ballots that will never be counted because they claim that the signature on the vote by mail ballots do not match. Voters will be purged. Despite the 145,000 people who have died, lost their lives to COVID-19, state like Texas refused to provide voters the option to vote by mail. Southwest Voter calls on Congress to authorize the Voting Rights Act, fix Section 4, and let us make sure that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act continues to provide protections for generations to come. Vote November the 3rd. Remember, su voto es su voz. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Antonia, you are next. And I should just ask everyone, please introduce yourself at the beginning so everyone knows who you are. Thank you. Oh, you're muted.
Directions really well. Good afternoon. I guess it's afternoon in the East Coast. My name is Antonia Hernandez, and I come to you from Los Angeles, which has been my home since 1956. I had the privilege of working with Teddy as we knew him as staffer, Senator Kennedy. I was the first Hispanic hired to be counsel to the Senate Judiciary in the late 70s, shortly after he took over the Judiciary Committee. And it's wonderful to be with my colleagues, Mark and Bird, who we worked together back in the late 70s, early 80s, and of course with Lydia, who worked with me at MALDF. I am currently the president of the California Community Foundation, but for 23 years, I worked at MALDF. And in fact, when the Democrats lost control of the Senate in 1980, I began working with MALDF first as the lead person in Washington, DC. And in that position, I worked very closely on the renewal of the Voting Rights Act of 1982. So first, I'm going to spend a minute or so telling you what I actually did for Senator Kennedy. I was hired, well, actually, let me go back. Under the previous chair, Thurman, I think, I can't recall that far back, there was a subcommittee. It was an immigration subcommittee. The senator dissolved the subcommittee and brought in the issue of immigration within the full Judiciary Committee. So I was hired basically to address issues that came up at the Judiciary Committee on Immigration. Also to be a sort of a representative on issues involving the Hispanic community. At that time in Washington, it was not the Latino community, it was the Hispanic community, an emerging community. But to work on that, and I also worked on judicial nominations, particularly those coming from California. And so I didn't work on Voting Rights Act with the senator until I left the Senate and was the regional counsel for MALDF in DC, and it involved the 1982 renewal. I have the privilege of working with Julius Chambers, with Elaine Jones, and with Congressman Lewis at that time, as we worked together to put together the strategy to renew the Voting Rights Act. And I want to give you a sense of context as to the environment. There was a split in strategy where the African-American community did not want to deal and include the renewal of Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, which involved bilingual education. And so one of the interesting things about sort of working on the 1982 Act, it was really the beginning of an understanding between the African-American community and the Latino community, and an expansion of understanding that the Voting Rights Act and voting was a critical issue for the emerging Latino community that at that time was perceived to be predominantly in the Southwest. And the senator played a really important role in nudging, the organizers from the outside to understand that in coalition, we would be so much more successful. And, it's interesting to look back, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, LDF, MALDEF, the NAACP, those were the organizations in the forefront of putting together the strategy and working with the advocacy groups on the Voting Rights Act. It was a hard-fought battle externally and forming the coalition, and internally. There was a lot of discussion on how we went about renewing the act. But to me, the most important thing, if I look back, back to 1982, was the relationships that were formed and the coalitions that were built. Because if you recall, that was the time when President Reagan came in, and French Smith and Nice were the attorney generals. And those were some difficult negotiations at that time and difficult barriers. But through it all, the beginning of that coalition between the African-American community and the Latino community, that was the beginning. That was the nucleus. Now, and my relationship with the senator remained till the time he passed. I was at his funeral. I am privileged to say that to this day, I'm still sort of kind of carrying that mantle. He appointed me to the Presidential Debates Commission, which I'm still on. I used to be on the board of the Institute of Politics at Harvard and on the Profiles and Courage committee. But I want to close by saying that the issue of voting could not be more important today. And that the tactics used in the 70s, in the 60s are alive and well today. And that we really, we are a democracy. And many of us know that we are a democracy, a republic of the people. Well, of the people means that the people need to participate in electing its elected officials. And there's a great deal of interest from many institutions to really reinvigorate our democracy, to include people from diverse communities, because we're a very diverse country today. And I will close by saying that I'm a member of the Academy of Arts and Science. And 2 months ago, the Academy released a report called Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century. And I was a member of that task force commission for 2 years. And in it, I would urge listeners to read that, because I think it has some really important recommendations on what we need to change in order to revitalize and re-energize our democracy. And that is the truest way for us to honor Congressman Lewis and Teddy, Senator Edward Kennedy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonia. Mark, you're next.
Okay, Mark. I started with Senator Kennedy in 1970 on what was going to be a 6-month fellowship. And that lasted a bit longer, 7 years. And after several years in the State Department's Human Rights Bureau, I returned to help coordinate the issues for the 1980 presidential campaign. I think it's important to recognize that the driving force throughout the senator's career was in fact his commitment to equal rights and to justice under law. And his passion was to use his voice and his vote to advance those goals. I want to go back to his maiden speech in the US Senate in April of 1964 in support of the Civil Rights Act that reflected that passion. He said, and I'm quoting, "In 1780, a Catholic in Massachusetts was not allowed to vote or hold public office. In 1840, an Irishman could not get a job above that of common laborer. In 1910, a Jew could not stay in places of public accommodation in the Berkshire Mountains." And the senator understood from the beginning that how we act at home is critical to how we're perceived abroad. And I think that he recognized the direct link between respect for civil rights at home and respect for human rights abroad, and he fought for them both. And it's important, I think, to add that there's no one who more determinedly sought to protect refugees fleeing from oppression or migrants seeking asylum than the senator throughout his 5 decades. Now, for my first several years, Antonia may well remember, before she arrived, I was the Spanish speaker, and so sometimes translator for the senator. We traveled together to South Texas in the early 1970s on migrant health issues, on poverty issues, and on voting rights. Senator met Willie Velasquez then. That was even before Willie established the Southwest Voter Registration Education Project. In California, we worked with Dolores Huerta, with Esteban Torres, with Congressman Ed Roybal, and Art Torres on the full range of civil rights, including voter registration. The senator keynoted the Constitutional Convention with Cesar Chavez when the United Farm Workers of America formally joined the AFL-CIO. At that East LA voter registration rally in 1972, the senator asked, and I'm quoting, "Why is it that the administration approves of legislation to make it easier to wiretap, but opposes legislation that would prohibit the denial of voting rights of Mexican Americans?" And I think it's important that we should specify that the minority voting rights provision that he pursued in the 1975 Voting Rights Act were actually unambiguous as to the rationale. The legislation and the law stated, the Congress finds that voting discrimination against citizens of language minorities is pervasive and national in scope. Where state and local officials conduct elections only in English, language minority citizens are excluded from participating in the electoral process, thereby violating their constitutional rights. One remedy was to extend the coverage of pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to language minorities populations. They were defined as American Indian, Asian American, Alaskan Natives, or of Spanish heritage. It's important to note one of the things that the senator did throughout his career was to recognize the importance of Native Americans receiving the rights of American citizens and being included in every part of the political process. Now, in those particular districts where they constituted 5% of the population, where only English was used in the 72 elections, and where 50% or less were registered or voted in 1972, they were covered. Since then, it's 5% in the district of minority language minority citizens, and where English language illiteracy is greater than the national illiteracy rate. And it provided in those areas, language minority citizens were entitled, and I think it's important, were entitled to receive bilingual voting materials, registration, ballots, explanations, and voting assistance at the polls. The senator saw civil rights as a complex quilt woven together to assure that all citizens received constitutional protections and better lives. He was a sponsor of the Title VII bilingual education amendments of the Elementary, Secondary, and Education Act of 1968, and the far more expansive acts, amendments 1974. He was the author of migrant health legislation, migrant health centers. And he always came back to voting rights. What he said was, without bilingual ballots and assistance at the polls, there are millions of our fellow citizens who would be unable to vote. That was at the hearings in 2006 on extending Section 203. And in fact, Section 203 now is extended from 2006 until 2032. What's the impact? The impact of those language minority provisions can be measured in a variety of ways. Between 73 and 2006, Hispanic elected officials increased 347%. Since then, there are now 6,832 Hispanic elected officials, according to NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected Officials. That includes 4 United States senators, 38 members of the House of Representatives. And also, he always argued that local representation was also key. In 1972 in California, there were 12% of the registered voters were Hispanic, The number of office holders, Hispanic office holders, 0.7%. In LA, 1 million Hispanic registered voters, not a single city council member. By 2015, California had 700 school board members alone, Texas 1,000. And of course, we've had recently Latino mayors of Los Angeles and now a Latino state attorney general. Now, the rationale has been since 1975, as it was stated in 2006, without the continuation of the Voting Rights Act protections, racial and language minority citizens will be deprived of the opportunity to exercise their right to vote or will have their votes diluted, undermining the significant gains made by minorities in the last 40 years. The senator said, let us not punish American citizens by conditioning the fundamental right to vote on the ability to read and write in English. I'll conclude just by going back to that 64 speech. When the senator finished, Senator Wayne Morris, you'll remember the name, he said, in my judgment, after listening to the speech, the junior senator, he was the junior senator then from Massachusetts, before he leaves the United States Senate, will have made a record in this body that will list him among the great senators in the history of the Senate. And so he was. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. Bert, last but not least.
Thanks, Harry. I worked for 3 exceptional senators, Ted Kennedy, Philip Hart, and Paul Sarbanes. In my considered view, Ted Kennedy was the most productive senator in American history, much of that involving human rights over 5 decades. So I'll try to briefly review the 5 decades in my 5 minutes and stay out of the weeds. From 1970 to 1976, I was counsel to Phil Hart, but I worked closely with Senator Kennedy and his office. Then I was President Carter's counsel for oversight of U.S. intelligence agencies and returned to the Judiciary Committee when Kennedy became chairman. In 1984, I went to work for a law firm, and after 9/11, worked on voting rights on the House Judiciary Committee for Chairman Conyers. 1965 saw Selma and the fierce battle of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that I'll refer to as the VRA. As Caroline said at the beginning, Kennedy fought to ban all poll taxes widely used to prevent poor Blacks from voting. That failed, but the compromise he did help to win made it a prominent national issue, and 2 years later, the Supreme Court ruled all poll taxes unconstitutional. The Act's 2 main parts are Section 2 and Section 5. Section 2 is a permanent nationwide prohibition against all forms of discrimination in voting. Section 5 requires preclearance by the Attorney General, prior approval of election law changes in those jurisdictions that it covers. This was a very dramatic intrusion on local government's authority in their elections. So while the rest of the Voting Rights Act is permanent, Section 5 was only passed for 5 years. In 1970, Senator Kennedy was Phil Hart's main ally in defeating efforts by President Nixon and Southern senators to eliminate preclearance. Hart and Kennedy won, and it was extended for another 5 years. I might note that in the 1970 effort, John Lewis, then head of the Voter Education Project in the South, was one of our witnesses. Kennedy's most striking role, however, was in lowering the voting age from 21 to 18, something of particular significance in recent years. He argued that 18-year-olds were treated as adults for many purposes, but especially the draft, and noted that almost half of those being killed in Vietnam were under 21. And he asked his colleagues who could say that such youths did not deserve the vote. Congress agreed, but Kennedy's work was not done because the Supreme Court then ruled that while Congress could lower the voting age for federal elections, to do so for state elections required a constitutional amendment. So Kennedy immediately got to work again, and the 26th Amendment was passed in record time. In 1975, the senator again worked closely with Senator Hart to preserve Section 5. It was extended for 7 years. But this time, Kennedy took the lead on the two most significant breakthroughs in that bill. As the other panelists have explained, pre-clearance was expanded to Latinos and other language minorities. And in Texas, by the way, large numbers of Blacks were also brought under its protection because they had been excluded in the original formula for Section 5 coverage. Second, the new Section 203 made voting rights meaningful, among others, for thousands of older Latinos, Vietnamese, and American Indian citizens. And as Antonio has described, it was still a controversial issue during the 1982 Voting Rights Act. In 1982, Section 5 again was about to expire. However, 2 years earlier in the Bolden case, the Supreme Court had crippled Section 2. Its statutory misinterpretation of that section made it almost impossible to win Section 2 lawsuits, which were our only weapon in those situations where Section 5 did not apply. Kennedy had to decide which section to save. The nation's civil rights coalition urged him to save both, but many Democrats warned him that trying to preserve both was a bridge too far. After a lot of serious debate, Kennedy decided to go for broke, and he ran the table. Section 5 was preserved for another 25 years, while the statutory clarification of Section 2, combined with the 1990 census, dramatically increased the number of minority members in Congress. The turning point was illustrative. It was when Kennedy convinced Senator Bob Dole to accept what became known as, quote, the Dole Compromise, a revised but still effective version of Section 2's text. This was Kennedy as master legislator. First, the bold Senate line, then reaching across the aisle to fashion compromises that still got the job done. In hindsight, that win was even more crucial than we realized at the time, because after Chief Justice Roberts gutted Section 5 in the Shelby case, only Section 2 remains to challenge voter suppression and made possible, for example, the successful lawsuit that Lydia described and the defeat of a voter ID bill in North Carolina described as one which discriminated with surgical precision. In 2006, the section was ending again, Section 5. Conservatives claimed that after 50 years of pre-clearance, it was no longer justified, given the dramatic increase in both minority voting and minority elected officials. The House responded by building an exhaustive legislative record, and in a bipartisan bill, extended the Voting Rights Act for 25 years. It passed overwhelmingly. In the Senate Judiciary Committee, Kennedy joined Patrick Leahy, who was then the ranking Republican, and Chairman Arlen Specter, and they defeated opposing committee conservatives. The House bill was endorsed by President Bush and passed the Senate unanimously. Predictably, its constitutionality was soon challenged. It survived a close shave in the so-called Mudno case, but not Justice Roberts' guillotine in the Shelby case. Roberts left the civil rights community scrambling to craft a bill that, on the one hand, could be said to be responsive to Roberts' majority opinion, but still kept the VRA as strong as possible, especially pre-clearance. Our result was introduced in both houses of Congress, but blocked year after year by the Republicans, right up to today, where, as was mentioned, the latest version sits on Majority Leader McConnell's desk, despite pleas led by John Lewis and now, sadly, on his behalf. And as has been discussed, multiple forms of voter suppression flood the election campaign of 2020, amplified by even louder cries of voter fraud in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. Senator Kennedy's record on voting rights is amazing, and we can only hope that we can respond to his and John Lewis and others, so many others, contributions, and maintain voting rights now for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bert, and thank you so much to all of the panelists. So I want to pick up with what Bert was talking about. I thought Bert did a really good job of talking about the 4 reauthorizations of the Voting Rights Act in 1970, in 1975, 1982, and in 2006. I think what a lot of people don't know about those reauthorizations is that all 4 reauthorizations were signed by Republican presidents. And each time there was an overwhelming bipartisan vote in the Congress. I was hoping one or more panelists could talk about why there was such strong bipartisan support for the Voting Rights Act every time, and even why Republican presidents that didn't particularly like the Voting Rights Act ended up signing the reauthorizations. Bert, why don't you start, but unmute yourself. And then Antonia. Antonia, why don't you start, because Bert's muted.
I would say that I would emphasize the ability of Senator Kennedy to form relationships. And I'll give you an example. In 1980, when the Democrats lost control of the Senate and Reagan came in, Senator Kennedy right away met with President-elect Reagan and began forming that trust and relationship. And as you know, if you have a relationship and a sense of trust, then you're able to talk about differences. And that helped tremendously, particularly when we were dealing with the attorney generals of that time. So I would say one of the most significant things that I saw in Senator Kennedy is his ability to form coalitions, to form relationships, and to find the common threads, and to really focus on those common threads and build from them. And that he did that on every issue that he worked on. I remember him, and I'll give you a story. When I worked for him, I was working on a bill and the Republicans, wanted something else, and we weren't getting everything that we thought was necessary. And he says to me, Antonia, because he used to call me Antonia, from Boston, America. So he says, Antonia, today we take half a loaf, and then tomorrow we come back for the other half. And I always kept that in mind. It's a lesson that I learned, but he never gave up. He never forgot that we were going after the second loaf of bread.
I would say that in addition, obviously, to the senator's amazing ability to work with Republicans across the aisle, and I would note at the opening of the Institute, almost every speech, I would say in particular President Obama's, but almost every speech by some of the Republicans who spoke at the opening of the Kennedy Institute emphasized Kennedy's amazing ability to go across the aisle, which is ironic because the Republicans, of course, spent all of his time in the Senate campaigning against him as the great left-wing threat to democracy. But in addition to that, times were different. We could count on probably 24 Republicans for most civil rights things, or well over a dozen, unless the presidency itself was perhaps at stake. But I can't name them all, but Hugh Scott, to start, was the majority leader. He was a Virginia gentleman by upbringing, but he was from Pennsylvania, and he was a stalwart on civil rights. So was Senator Pearson from Kansas, Lowell Weicker from Connecticut, Saxby from Ohio, Lugar from Indiana. So there was a raft of Republicans who really cared about civil rights, or for whatever political and personal combinations. It was totally different from the almost solid wall of opposition in the Senate now.
Yeah,
And it was Matt
say the same
Mathias,
thing.
it was Jacobs, it was Matt Mathias,
Right.
and you have to
Oh, Mac
remember,
Mathias, yeah.
you remember who spoke at his funeral? One of his closest
John
friends,
McCain,
Orrin Hatch.
Warren
So
Hatch.
it was very personal.
Right.
They could argue at the hearing, like, cats and mouses. Once they left the hearing, it wasn't personal.
Although,
They had these personal relationships. So it's very, very different.
well,
I
Go ahead,
also
Mark.
think- Yeah, I was going to say that if you go back, the relationship that the senator had with Republican senators, Ed Brooke,
Mm-hmm,
Javits,
mm-hmm.
Pace, Mathias,
Yes,
and afterwards with John McCain.
yes.
Remember the legislation on immigration reform that would have given a path to citizenship to all, at that time, undocumented, which would have been about 12 million, that he and John McCain proposed that together. I mean, and usually the first question out of his mouth when you proposed a piece of legislation was, who's the Republican co-sponsor?
Yep.
It was easy at that time. It's a different world now.
I want to ask a question to Lydia about that. Lydia, why do you think that the politics of voting rights have shifted so much since then? I mean, you look at the bills to restore the Voting Rights Act. Only one House Republican voted for the bill to restore the Voting Rights Act in December. Only one Senate Republican, Lisa Murkowski, is sponsoring legislation to restore the Voting Rights Act now. How did we get from a situation where the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized in 2006, 390 to 33 in the House and 98 to 0 in the Senate, just not that long ago, to a situation where almost no Republicans are supporting this today?
I think that in addition to what Antonia and Bert and Mark have talked about in terms of the internal politics and the ability of Senator Edwards to coalesce and develop partnerships and real trust with both sides of the aisle, we have to look at the external realities. let's not forget that Reagan won with a landslide. And he was not at all worried about his loss for the next election. Because first of all, there wasn't enough Latinos that were registered to vote. We were a smaller population, a smaller group. The power of the Latino vote and the African-American vote is extraordinary today. California is now 25% of the share of the vote is Latino. Arizona, you would have never believed that, is 25% of the share of the vote. Thanks to, in large part, to Proposition 187 in California, that the communities move forward. It made a change in Arizona, Prop 1070, and to some extent, this SB 4 in Texas, which we're also going to see about 24, 25% of share of the vote. So I think that there were a couple of factors. One, people who are in control right now on the Senate side and in the presidency were not worried at that time that their power would be relinquished because of the lack of voters that might vote against them. I think that's one. I think the other thing is that this climate today, because of President Trump, has become so negative and anti-Latino and anti-immigrant and anti-Black and anti-everything, that it's a party that is attacking almost all communities. And then on top of that, the senators that are Republican, are part of his party, are worried that they too will be attacked, not only in the primaries, although we're done with that, but attacked, and then they'll have someone who will not work with it. So I think that those political factors are an important factor, but the Latino electorate has grown dramatically. In 2000, there were no more than 7 million registered Latino voters, 7.5 million. We're gonna get close to 18 million this cycle nationwide, but electoral votes per state do matter, and that's the difference.
I want to ask another question about legislation before the Congress. So there is legislation to restore the Voting Rights Act that would cover states with a more recent history of discrimination, that would update the formula that the Supreme Court struck down. There's also legislation to have federal voting standards. And I'm curious what you guys think about that, because the new VRA bill, as good as it might be, still wouldn't necessarily cover states like Wisconsin and states like Ohio that are more recent bad actors when it comes to voting rights. So I'm wondering what you guys think, what legislation you think the Congress needs to pursue to try to protect the right to vote of everybody.
Let me just say one thing, and that is that so far as the language minority population, it's crucial to keep that language in. As you know, every 5 years, the Census Bureau basically says these are the jurisdictions that are covered. And the last finding in 2016, which covers the coming election, found 263 counties, cities, and other jurisdictions in 29 states where Section 203 applies. So it's crucial to ensure that that continues. And as you were saying, that includes several of those states that you mentioned. So you don't want to do anything that reduces the coverage of that legislation.
And I would say that another factor is sort of the growth in diversity of the United States, the demographics. But interestingly enough, it goes back to the philosophy of the two parties. And there is a feeling, at least from my perception, that Republicans have given up on having a rainbow coalition within the party. And so therefore, they're not only trying to minimize the votes of people of color, they're now, and I think to your point, trying to minimize the votes of people that don't agree with their philosophy. You get that in Wisconsin and Minnesota, in states where there is a minority population, but that's not the entire population. So I think what you're having right now, and that's something we need to look at, is what do these parties stand for? And what do they fear? And in the Republican Party, the perception in general, and these are generalities, is that African Americans in general will not vote for a Republican, that Latinos in general will not vote. Right now, we have the issue of women and suburban women who voted for the current president in 16. And the question is, well, will they vote for that? So you're dealing with not only ethnic issues, but you're dealing with philosophical issues of the parties that are self-defining who's in the tent.
I want to
I would
ask
say-
each of you guys to quickly tell us what concerns you most about the 2020 election.
I'll start very quickly. That's the issue of COVID and the impact on the ability of states to ensure that everyone who wants to vote but is fearful because of COVID and therefore needs to have an absentee ballot is able to get that. If I had to say one single piece of legislation I'd love to see to pass tomorrow would be a provision that would say anyone who wants an absentee ballot throughout the United States can get one, period. And the other is to have funds and training for poll workers, funds to cover what you have to do in order to count those ballots. It's not enough just to get absentee ballots out to the people and they send them in. Those ballots need then to be counted. And there's a lot more that needs to be done to provide resources and training to poll workers and to the states in order to have that occur.
I want to go back because I would echo what Mark said about concerns to the previous question and make a few quick points. One, there's no constitutional right to vote expressly in the Constitution. Jesse Jackson Jr., Jesse Jackson's son, when he was a congressman, proposed it, and there's now a resurfacing of the idea of a constitutional amendment for the right to vote broadly. In terms of legislation, Ari, I think that those kinds of standards are so likely to face a constitutional challenge with a court now in play. And I should add that in the 1982 fight, the by far biggest opponent who was writing virulent memos to the president or to the attorney general against preserving Section 2 was Chief Justice Roberts. So I would not be very sanguine about legislation going up, especially because going nationwide, Congress wouldn't have the ability to use the power it's given under the 14th and 15th Amendment in the final clause to implement those constitutional amendments where it can make the showing of discrimination.
Right.
But I would favor using money, assuming we are in control of Congress, because otherwise none of these bills would move, to condition federal funding for all sorts of things on the right voting procedures, which I think could be done. Again, however, you'd be facing the courts. I also want to just say that in the interest of time, I didn't mention 3 other people who were on Kennedy's staff and were quite involved in what I talked about. One, Jim Flug, who was Kennedy's chief counsel on judiciary in the early 70s. And when he was not busy beating terrible Supreme Court nominees or starting, and he started the Congressional Watergate investigations, he was very involved in all of Kennedy's work on the Voting Rights Act. Secondly, with regard to lowering the voting age, that was Harry Parker, Kennedy's extraordinary legislative director, who really was the staff person helping Kennedy on that. And finally, in the 2006 vote, Kennedy was lucky to have William Yeomans who had already been an expert on voting rights in the Justice Department as his staff director, and they played key roles.
We only have a few minutes left, so I want to get Lydia and Antonia's perspective. And I also want to ask you both, can you also please address the importance of the census? And if you are concerned that there could be an undercount of Latinos in the census, the new executive order by the president, and how that might affect voting rights as well. So 2020 plus the census for both of you.
Let me start with the census. There's definitely going to be an undercount. No question about it. Here in LA County, we are heading the outreach effort to count LA County. And I will tell you, it's been an uphill battle. So whatever the numbers tell you, notwithstanding what the president recently said, there is definitely going to be an undercount. So the question is not whether there's going to be an undercount and it's going to be significant, is what other means of gathering information were we allowed to supplement the census count, because there are other mechanisms. So I think that that's really, really important. And, you know, my biggest fear, and I talk from California's perspective, which is very, you know, somewhat different. I mean, you know, for November, we have the issue of technology coming into the picture. We have the issue of the virus. You know, all of these factors are playing into it. And that's why what Mark said is so important. Voting by mail is something that we're going to have to do, but it's not going to be enough. You know, for poor communities, for immigrant newly people who have become citizens, for people of color, you need to have a place for them to vote. And the question is, how are we going to do that? Luckily, our Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, is very attuned to this. So it's not that we're not going to have an undercount, but we're going to do everything that we can to make sure. I worry about Texas, about New Mexico, about Arizona. You know, I worry about the Southeast, because the suppression is the same always. Changing the polls, asking for IDs, verification. You know, if you're Latino or immigrant looking at asking for citizenship with the right to vote. So the good old-fashioned ways of suppression are still very much alive.
I would agree with Antonia. Let me sort of try to put this in as succinct as I can. I worry about lack of investment in the Latino being turned out, so we can turn out Latinos, particularly not just in the states where we expect Latinos to turn out, like Texas and California, but Texas is important, it's 38 electoral votes, but Georgia and Arizona and North Carolina. And I worry for a couple of reasons. There's a misconception and a wrong narrative, a flawed narrative that Latinos do not vote. And the history shows that it does. But it's also a young electorate, and young electorate needs to understand why are they being, why do you want their vote? How do you garner their vote? So one of the things that's important to Latinos, among other things besides jobs and education and healthcare, is that the immigration issue has become much like choices for women, the litmus test. The other thing I worry about is that we are not going to count everybody in the census. And Texas was supposed to gain 3 to 4 congressional seats. Arizona was supposed to gain 2. I don't know what's going to happen with the way that we're having to count. All of the states, particularly in Latino majority districts, the rate of return, self-respond, it's only in the 40s, not in the 60s. Puerto Rico is at 8 percentage points. It's a very sad place where it's at. But given the redistricting and the elections, I worry that we are going to have lots of forms of voter suppression, similar to what took place in the 60s when Congressman Lewis was involved. But we're also going to have to worry about the next Supreme Court justice. And we are not having enough conversations about that. And none of the changes that are important to the Latino community and communities of color and people who care about a society that is truly inclusive will matter unless we all register and vote. And that's what I worry about every single day.
Right. Let me just ask one other thing.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I've been instructed we are unfortunately out of time. I know we could have this conversation for 3 to 4 hours, and I imagine the Kennedy staffers over a few drinks could have it well into the night. But I really appreciate all of you joining us, offering your insights, offering your historical perspective. A lot of the history that was talked about today, I wrote about in my book, Give Us the Ballot, and also people can check out my writing from motherjones.com to learn more about the current efforts to restore the Voting Rights Act. So thank you so much for all your perspectives, and Caroline, I'm turning it over to you.
Hi again, and on behalf of the Kennedy Institute, I want to thank our panelists, Ari Berman, Lydia Camarillo, Antonio Hernandez, Mark Schneider, and Bert Weitz for this incredible conversation this afternoon. As we anticipate the election ahead of us, it is imperative, as our panelists have said, to fully acknowledge and understand all the many hurdles that others have had to throw aside in order for us to exercise our democratic rights. We at the Kennedy Institute are very much focusing on these topics through our programming this summer and fall. And we're excited to launch a new website dedicated to understanding and exercising our right to vote next month. But until then, we can look forward to a recording of the program today being available on the Kennedy Institute website in the next day or two. So be sure to share that with your networks. In addition, as we just sort of have been discussing, there are some steps that we all can take to make sure that we're engaged. Make sure you're registered to vote. If you're in Massachusetts or in one of those states that allows vote by mail, keep an eye out for your mailbox for that request form for voting by mail. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to fill out your census form by going to 2020census.gov. Thank you all for your continued commitment and dedication to democracy and civic engagement. And again, on behalf of the Kennedy Institute, we'll see you next time.